There is a point in the 19th century when the maps of Europe began to have gaps. Not the honest gaps of unexplored territory, those had mostly closed by then. Not the vague coastlines of the early cartographers who drew sea monsters where the surveys ran out. These were different. These were deliberate silences. Blank spaces where something was, where surveyors had walked and measured and noted, where the instruments had done their work, but where the final published map showed nothing. Nothing labeled, nothing drawn. Just empty paper where a property existed in the real world. Wealthy families had always exercised influence over how their estates appeared in print. The Ordnance Survey in Britain, which was conducting the most rigorous national cartographic project in the world through the 19th century, received regular correspondence from landowners about the treatment of their properties. Some wanted their houses shown clearly. Others wanted the opposite. The right address, in the right era, carried enough weight to make a survey team hesitant. A private island, accessible by boat, not by road, surrounded by water that formed a natural boundary, was particularly easy to omit. Easy to render as featureless water. Easy to erase. The Ordnance Survey was a national project answerable to Parliament. But the men who financed Parliament were not always inclined to make that accountability run in every direction. Whether any specific Rothschild island was erased from any specific map is a question that lives in the gap between legend and documented record. And I want to be honest about that gap before we go any further. What I can tell you, what the actual documented record shows, is that the Rothschild family built something in the 19th century that was more strategically invisible than any island could be. They built a private intelligence network that no government agency could access. A private financial architecture that no parliamentary committee could fully examine. And a private communication system that moved faster than any diplomatic courier in the world. They built an island of information. And it was never on any map because it was never meant to be found. To understand what the Rothschilds actually were, not the caricature that has accumulated around the name through 2 centuries of conspiracy theory and genuine history intertwined, you have to start with Meyer Amschel Rothschild in Frankfurt in the late 18th century. A coin dealer and moneylender working from a house marked with a red shield. Rothschild in German means red shield. Meyer Amschel built a modest business into a significant one through a combination of expertise, reliability, and a gift for handling the finances of powerful clients. His most important client was Wilhelm IX, the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, one of the wealthiest sovereigns in Germany, whose fortune Meyer Amschel managed with enough skill and discretion to lay the foundation for everything that followed. When Napoleon's forces occupied Hesse-Kassel, Meyer Amschel helped hide and manage Wilhelm's assets, demonstrating discretion under impossible conditions. He kept a sovereign's secret from an occupying emperor. That was the original island, built not from geography, but from silence. What followed was the 5 sons. Before he died in 1812, Meyer Amschel had positioned his sons in 5 of the most important financial cities in Europe. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt. Salomon went to Vienna. Nathan went to London. Karl went to Naples. James went to Paris. This was not happenstance. It was architecture. A private banking network spanning the 5 major capitals of the continent, connected by private couriers, private correspondence, and a family bond that made the 5 houses function as a single organism. Gathering information in one city, transmitting it to another, and acting on it before any government or competitor knew what had been learned. The sons wrote to each other almost daily in a polyglot mixture of German, Hebrew, Yiddish, and private cipher. Archivists and historians working through the surviving correspondence have described it as one of the densest private communication records in European history. a continuous, real-time conversation about money, politics, intelligence, and family that ran for decades across 5 countries simultaneously. What each brother did in his city was broadly the same and entirely distinct. Nathan in London became the dominant force in British government bond markets, financing the Duke of Wellington's Peninsular War campaigns and managing British war debt at a scale that made him effectively indispensable to the Treasury. James in Paris became, by most measures, the wealthiest man in France, more than the king, as some observers noted, and financed French railway expansion and government borrowing through successive regimes. Salomon in Vienna built the Austrian rail network and maintained such close relations with Metternich's government that he was effectively a state institution in private clothing. Between them, they covered the continent. Any financial information generated anywhere in Europe was, within days, known at all 5 houses simultaneously. Each government they served knew only its own situation. The family knew all of them. The letters themselves were a form of camouflage, written in the family's private polyglot code, referencing people and institutions by private nicknames, discussing transactions in terms that were opaque to anyone outside the circle. They could be read without being understood and intercepted without being decoded. Archivists who have spent years with the correspondence describe the experience of reading it as something like watching an enormous chess game in which you understand the mechanics of the pieces, but cannot always determine what position is being discussed or why a particular move was made. The opacity was deliberate. It was the same principle as the island. Make the thing real, but make it unreadable. Let people see the surface. Keep the content for those who had the key. Even today, with the archive partially open, there are letters that scholars have not been able to fully decode. The family built a private language inside a private institution, and that language was, in the most literal sense, a wall. The courier system was the foundation of the information advantage. At a time when governments communicated through official diplomatic pouches that moved with military escorts, the Rothschilds maintained their own private courier service, faster, more reliable, and immune to official interception because it carried no official status. Private couriers on private horses, sometimes by private boat across the channel, carrying sealed letters in their private code. And later, when even faster transmission became possible, the family adopted carrier pigeons. This is not a legend or a metaphor. The Rothschilds maintained a documented carrier pigeon network between their major houses for decades in the 19th century, using birds trained on specific routes to carry messages in capsules attached to their legs. It was, in its era, the fastest private communication system in existence. Governments were still relying on horses. The Rothschilds were flying. The most famous consequence of this intelligence advantage involved the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815. Nathan Rothschild in London needed to know the outcome before the official dispatches arrived, because the outcome would determine everything about British government bonds, which would collapse if Napoleon won and surge if Wellington did. The exact details of how Nathan received the news have been disputed and embellished over 2 centuries. The story that he personally spread false rumors of a British defeat to depress bond prices before buying at the bottom is now considered mythology rather than history. What is not disputed is the core fact. The Rothschilds knew the outcome of Waterloo before the British government did, and they acted on that knowledge. Their private network delivered the information that shifted markets before a single official word had arrived. The intelligence gap was not ours. It was more than a day. And in financial markets, a day's advantage over every other participant on Earth is worth more than almost anything money can buy. This was not luck. This was the system functioning as designed. Meyer Amschel had built something that was specifically intended to operate beyond the knowledge of governments and competitors. A private territory of information that no outsider could enter and no official process could examine. Call it an island, if you like. It was surrounded by water just as effectively as any island in the sea. The water was information, and only the Rothschilds knew how to cross it. By the middle of the 19th century, the Rothschilds were financing governments the way other businesses financed individual customers. The Austrian government, the Prussian government, the British government, the French government. At various points in the 1820s and 1830s, multiple European governments were simultaneously borrowing money from different branches of the same family. The family's total knowledge of each government's financial situation, knowledge gathered from their agents in every capital, from their relationships with treasury officials, from their private information network, gave them a picture of European sovereign finances that no single government possessed. They could see the whole board. No one else could. The spring of 1848 demonstrated what that vantage point was worth in practice. Revolutionary uprisings spread across nearly every major European capital in that year. Paris, Vienna, Berlin, Budapest, Milan, Prague, in what became the continent's most widespread political upheaval since the Napoleonic Wars. Governments fell and were reconstituted. Thrones shook, bond markets collapsed, and then partially recovered. To most observers, it was chaos. To the Rothschilds, who had agents in every affected capital and communication lines between all of them, it was information. They could see, in near real time, which governments were likely to survive and which were genuinely at risk of collapse. They adjusted their positions accordingly. When the dust settled, their intelligence had served them again, not because they had caused the upheaval, but because they had understood it faster than anyone else while it was happening. There was also, woven through the correspondence and the memoirs and the diplomatic records of the era, something stranger and harder to categorize. The Rothschilds were approached, repeatedly, by governments seeking not just financing but political intelligence. Who was likely to win a particular conflict? Whether a particular government would survive a particular crisis? What a particular minister was privately planning? Several European governments paid for this access in one form or another. The island of information was, in this sense, a sovereign territory, one that charged its own kind of customs duties to anyone who wanted to pass through. The British branch became the de facto financier of the British Empire's most sensitive operations. The transaction that demonstrates this most clearly came in November 1875. The Khedive of Egypt, drowning in debt, was selling his shares in the Suez Canal Company, shares that represented Britain's best chance to secure control of the vital waterway connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli needed to move immediately. Parliament was not in session. Raising public funds through normal channels was impossible. Disraeli sent an envoy to Lionel de Rothschild at New Court in St. Swithin's Lane with a single question: could N.M. Rothschild lend the British government £4 million by tomorrow? Lionel reportedly ate a grape, considered the question, and said yes. £4 million, roughly 400 million in contemporary terms, was transferred from a private bank to the British government overnight, without parliamentary approval, without public announcement, without any of the machinery of democratic finance. Britain bought the Suez Canal stake. Disraeli announced it to Parliament as a fait accompli, informing them the shares had already been purchased. He later wrote to Queen Victoria calling it a fairy tale. What he did not explain to Parliament, what was not discussed publicly, was that the entire transaction had been accomplished by bypassing Parliament entirely. Using a private bank's credit to commit the British government before any democratic process could slow it down. The empire's strategic position in the world had been secured through a private conversation in a private building between a prime minister and a banker, on a timeline that democratic deliberation could not have matched. The room at New Court was not labeled on any public map. The Rothschild banking house operated behind doors that did not open to the general public. This same privacy extended to the family's physical properties across Europe. Waddesdon Manor in Buckinghamshire, completed in 1883, modeled on a French chateau filled with works of art that had once belonged to the French crown, was a private house on a scale that few monarchs could match. Château Ferrières outside Paris, where James de Rothschild held court in a palace that dwarfed many official government buildings, hosted private dinners at which the guests included emperors and prime ministers whose conversations never entered any official record. These properties appeared on maps. What happened inside them did not. The guests who attended the most important dinners were never formally listed anywhere. The agreements that formed over those dinner tables, the signals about government borrowing capacity, the assessments of political stability, the understandings between financiers and ministers that shaped the following year's policy, moved privately from the room into the offices of governments, carrying no paper trail and leaving no record that any historian could later recover in full. The Austrian branch of the family had perhaps the starkest experience of what erasure actually looks like when it is imposed rather than chosen. Salomon Rothschild's Vienna branch had built a magnificent private palace on the Ringstrasse, financed the construction of the Austrian railway network, and maintained extraordinary influence in Habsburg financial affairs for nearly a century. Then came March 1938, and the Anschluss. Louis von Rothschild, the head of the Vienna branch, was arrested and held for more than a year. His release was purchased at an almost incomprehensible cost. He was forced to sign over essentially the entire Austrian Rothschild enterprise: the bank, the industrial holdings, the estates, the palace, in exchange for permission to leave the country. When he left, the Vienna branch of one of Europe's most powerful dynasties ceased to exist. The properties were confiscated. The archive was seized. The family name was removed from institutions it had built for decades. After the war, Austria was famously reluctant to reckon with the theft. Restitution claims moved through courts for decades, some properties not returned until the late 20th century. That is what enforced erasure looks like in its most complete form, not a map without a label, but a history without a claimant, tended that way for as long as the tendency could be maintained. The Rothschild archive in London was not open to outside researchers until well into the 20th century, and even then what was made available was curated and selected. What that curated archive reveals, to researchers who have been given access, is a private running commentary on the political and financial life of 19th century Europe, written by people who had better information than any government in it. The Rothschilds were not just financiers. They were the best-informed private intelligence service in Europe, and their intelligence belonged to them alone. The connection to the physical map returns with the Balfour Declaration of 1917. When British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour drafted the Statement of British Support for a Jewish Homeland in Palestine, he did not address it to a Jewish organization or government. He addressed it to Lord Walter Rothschild, the second Baron Rothschild, a trustee of the British Museum who happened to be the most prominent Jewish figure in Britain. The letter that reshaped the map of the modern Middle East was addressed to a private individual. Its terms had been negotiated in private meetings between British officials and Rothschild representatives over months. The geography of the future had been decided, again, in rooms that appeared on no public map. The people whose descendants would live and die within the borders that letter set in motion were not in the room. They were not consulted. They found out the same way most people find out about decisions made in private rooms, after the decision was already made. when changing it had already become very complicated. The physical island of the title, the one that may or may not have existed, that may or may not appear on some archived survey sheet filed in a records office somewhere in Europe, matters less than the island the family actually built and inhabited. Privacy, in sufficient quantity and sufficient depth, becomes its own kind of territory. It has boundaries. It has an inside and an outside. It is accessible only to those with the right credentials. And the people who built it understood, from the beginning, that the most valuable thing in any financial or political system is not the money or the power. It is the knowledge. The information that moves faster than anyone else's. The picture of the whole board that nobody else can see. That was the Rothschild Island, built in Frankfurt in the 18th century, extended to 5 capitals by 5 brothers, maintained by carrier pigeon and private courier and coded letter for 100 years. It financed empires, shaped the outcome of wars, and redrew the borders of nations. And in doing so, it never once appeared on any map that an ordinary person could read. It is still operating. The family still exists. The archive is still being opened, carefully, one drawer at a time. The 5 arrows of the coat of arms, the symbol Meyer am Shell chose to represent his 5 sons sent to 5 capitals, still appear on the family crest. What remains in the drawers nobody has opened yet is a question that lives in the same gap as the island itself, between what is documented and what is suspected, between what the record shows and what the record was designed never to show.